Hi Year 11, this is lesson 2 on the League of Nations. Please make sure that you did the lesson on the knowledge before you attempt this one. So when we did our exam technique on the Treaty of Versailles, which was our first conflict topic, we only did source questions and then the final question, which was the question 4. And actually we primarily focused on those source questions. So what we're going to do this time is this week we're going to focus purely on knowledge style questions. We're going to be looking at questions 3s and 4s. But today we're going to have a look at question 3, which we didn't look at all when we were looking at the Treaty of Versailles. If you remember, there are 4 questions on the whole conflict and tension paper. The first one is that little source question, which is source A is critical or supports source A. How do you know? And it's just a 4-mark quick question. The second question is where you've got 2 sources and you're asked about how useful they are about a particular thing. This third question is about how you write an account. And the fourth question, of course, is the one where you get the statement and you have to do the big 16-mark question about whether you agree with that statement or not. So as I said, today we're focused on question 3. So question 3 is a write an account of. So as it says here in this question, what you are doing is you are demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of a sequence of events. So you're going to be looking at potentially an event, what happened and what its consequences were. You need to try and think about 2 steps of the sequence. So it might be looking at the causes of what happened, and then the second paragraph might be on the consequences, making sure that you link everything back to the question and saying how it led to something happening. Usually you'd be answering this in 2 paragraphs in around 10 minutes. The first example of this kind of question is this one here. Write an account of how Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia led to an international crisis. So we're focusing on the invasion of Abyssinia and how that led to an international crisis. Of course, we're looking to try and gain 8 marks at 4 marks per paragraph. So at 2 paragraphs, it's quite simple in this kind of event. We can look at, well, what were the causes of the invasion, what actually happened during that invasion, and what were the consequences, really focusing on the League actions and the Italian actions as well. So the first part of this would be to tackle, well, what happened with the invasion? What was the cause of it? So you'd need to be thinking about, well, why did Mussolini invade Abyssinia at this point? You can't avoid at this point the depression and how badly Italy had been affected. And you'd start off by talking about that in your first paragraph. You might talk about him trying to divert public attention away from the problems that he had at home, but also to gain extra natural resources in order to help bolster the failing Italian economy. You might also talk about revenge for earlier incidents. In 1896, Italians had been humiliated and beaten by the Abyssinians. So part of the invasion was about that. You might also talk, of course, at this point about what happened at the watering hole. That's what this first paragraph needs to focus on. So the second paragraph will be focusing on the consequences. So you'd be thinking about things such as the suggestion of giving land to Italy, those partial economic sanctions that we talked about in the last lesson. Of course, that planned Hall-of-Al Pact between the British and the French, trying to hand over most of Abyssinia to Italy, the full invasion of the country, which Mussolini decided upon because he decided that he wasn't going to get stopped, and then the real lack of League reaction and how that undermined and helped to finish off the League of Nations and, of course, therefore led to an international crisis. The first paragraph, of course, you're going to link it back to being an international crisis because the League had to get involved in this incident between the 2 countries. With this first question, I don't expect you to do anything. What I've got for you, and I'll give you a printout of this, or your teacher will give you a printout of this next week for your exam book, is an example of how you could answer this really, really well. So here's a really high-level answer. This would get 8 out of 8. So Italy had been devastated by the Depression in the early 1930s. Mussolini needed to divert the public attention away from problems at home. He also needed vital raw materials. As a final bonus, an invasion of Abyssinia would give Italy revenge for humiliation and defeat against the Abyssinians in 1896. Therefore, a small incident at a watering hole at Walwal was blown out of proportion and turned into a crisis. So we're already linking it back to it being a crisis. Around 30 Italians had been killed and Mussolini demanded a slice of Abyssinia. The League failed to act decisively, and this led to an international crisis. So what we've got in this first paragraph is lots of knowledge about why this happened and what happened, and also that crucial link to why this led to an international crisis. Our second paragraph is really focusing on the League action, British and French action, and Italian as well. So the League set up a commission in February 1935, notice the use of dates there, which reported in September, suggesting giving part of Abyssinia to Italy. Mussolini rejected the plan and invaded. So of course we can see that leading into a massive crisis. The League banned arms sales and put sanctions on rubber and metal. It did not close the Suez Canal or ban oil and coal sales. In December 1935, news leaked out of the Hall-Laval Pact, a secret plan by Britain and France to give most of Abyssinia to Italy. This completely undermined the League. By May 1936, Mussolini had completed his conquest, his invasion of Abyssinia. In June, Haile Selassie went in person to the League of Nations. He was ignored. This deepened, because we've already said there was an international crisis, the international crisis, as the League was now effectively dead as a peacekeeping organisation. That is a good 8-mark question. So with this second example, this is where I'm going to ask you to do a little bit more. So this question is write an account of how the Great Depression led to an international crisis. And in order to make sure you're successful in this question, your paragraphs would focus on two things. The first thing that you might focus on is what happened with Japan and Manchuria. So hopefully stuff that we know about well. And the second would be on what we've already talked about in that first example, on what happened with Italy and Abyssinia. But this time you're only writing one paragraph on each of those two incidents. You've got to be careful and not go into too much detail, but also make sure that you're linking it to the Great Depression and the international crisis. So in a moment or two, I'm going to get you to pause this PowerPoint, pause this narrated YouTube clip, and I want you to have a go at writing this paragraph. You, of course, can use your notes from yesterday and any revision materials that you've got on Japan and Manchuria. You don't have to write this off the top of your head, and I would like you to do it in just 5 minutes. So write an account of how the Great Depression led to an international crisis. So your first paragraph is going to be all about the impact on Japan and Manchuria. So first of all, we're going to think about, well, what was the effect of the Depression on Japan? Well, of course, they relied on foreign trade, and that completely stopped. Remember that the Japanese main export was silk. That's a luxury item, and they no longer were able to export the volume of that they needed to pay for the things that they needed for their population. Their land was mountainous, a lot of it inhospitable and unable to grow crops on it. So gaining Manchuria was all about gaining food, raw materials, but it was also about the prestige that the Japanese wanted. They saw themselves as a world power, and yet they were really struggling in the Depression. So then you talk about, well, what did this lead to? And what it led to, of course, was the invasion of Manchuria. So you talk about, again, briefly, what happened there. Well, why was this an international crisis? Well, it's an international crisis, of course, because of the failures of the League here. The League did not do what they needed to. They only used moral sanctions, and that failed. And the Japanese got away with the invasion, and that undermined the League. So for 5 minutes, you're going to tell me, well, why did the Great Depression hurt the Japanese? How that led them on to invading Manchuria, and what that invasion looked like, and how it actually harmed the League and led to a greater international crisis. 5 minutes, have a go at that paragraph. Okay, so now I'm going to have a look at the second paragraph. And just like with the first one, I'm going to tell you what it needs to contain. So we're still looking at how the Great Depression led to an international crisis. So in this second paragraph, you're going to focus on Italy and Abyssinia. So a second incident that came out of the Great Depression was the Abyssinian crisis. So just like with the Japanese, the Italians had relied on imports and world trade. The Depression therefore had completely affected the Italian economy. The Italian economy was on the verge of collapse in 1934. Remember that Mussolini wanted to divert that public attention, and he desperately needed to get hold of new raw materials that he wasn't able to in these times of very, very low trading. Of course, what this led to was the invasion of Abyssinia. Of course, they've got the excuse of what happened at the watering hole, but really this was about the Great Depression and the impact on Italy. So you'll focus on, well, what did the Italians do, And then you'll again talk about the mishandling of this by Britain, France, and the League of Nations, and how that delved us into a deeper international crisis. Making sure again that you're only writing for 5 minutes. You're not going to be able to write about every single little thing to do with the incident, but you should remember to focus on, well, how did the Great Depression lead to Italy being in trouble? What did the Italians do to try and get themselves out of trouble, i.e. invading Abyssinia? And why did this lead to problems? Why was this an international crisis? By focusing on the lack of action by other nations. 5 minutes, have a go. So our final question is an optional one. This is one that I'm not going to tell you the answer to. Obviously, I'm going to give you a little bit of guidance now, but this is to see, have you learned enough about the technique? So write an account of how the failures of the 1920s undermined the League. Excuse me. So in order to answer this question, you need to talk about 2 incidents from the 1920s which undermined the League, because we're looking at how that happened. So the 2 incidents it makes it sense for you to look at are the incidents that happened in Vilna and the incident that happened in Corfu. And these are an attached sheet here, so it gives you all of the information on what happened in Vilna and why it was a problem, and the same for what happened within Corfu. If you use that, you've essentially got the basis for paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, making sure, of course, you tell me what happened in the incident, but making sure, of course, you're demonstrating that you've understood how that undermined the League of Nations and led to the League of Nations eventually failing. You should spend about 10 minutes on that, about 5 minutes per paragraph. So that's the end of lesson 2. What we'd like you to do is make sure you continue with that preparation for the short answer test. If you've got a little bit of time spare at the end of this lesson, it didn't take you the full hour to go through that PowerPoint and to have a go at those paragraphs and maybe the optional question at the end, make sure you're spending some more time now preparing for that short answer test. Make sure you know that knowledge is going to get you to that 100% next week. Also, continue to make any other revision materials that you think might be useful, so mind maps, revision clocks, etc. And finally, if you've got the 10 minutes to spare, have a go at that optional question. Hand in anything you like via email or via Show My Homework, or you could hand it in person to your teacher next week. Just like with the last lesson, if you have any problems at all, please make sure you contact myself, Miss Monroe or Miss Bowden, and we'll be only too happy to help you.